Hello, evil minions. It is I, your mean and evil overlord. And that is right. Your mean and evil overlord here. It is Tuesday, April 21st, 2020. And this will be your first part one, of a lesson on the causes of the Spanish-American War. But before we get to that, couple quick announcements. All right. First announcement is grades and grading. I've been a little hesitant to talk about grades and grading so far because I haven't really been sure what the district was going to do. They just announced here last week that they are going to use third quarter as your baseline. So if you go into your student portal in Tyler, you're going to notice that for fourth quarter, for me, I have gone in and created an assignment called third quarter baseline. And I went ahead and put in a 100-point assignment, and I gave you whatever your third quarter grade was. I assigned that as your grade. And so that will be the base that we start with. And then as we add assignments, your grade will go up or go down depending on what you're turning in. And then we, at the end of the quarter, we'll take a look at where you're at, what your participation has been, and we will go from there. As the policy adapted by the school board last week said, your grade can go down if you're not participating, if you're not turning those things in, and a bunch of you are not turning things in. Your grade can absolutely go down. So make sure that you are getting stuff done. And I know that times are hectic a little bit here and there, but please contact me if you're having any difficulties. But yes, go into Tyler. You will see grades. I have started putting in grades for the assignment that was due last week, The Age of Imperialism. Those of you that have turned it in have gotten a grade assigned, and I'm in the process of putting those in now. You should see those by the end of today. By the end of today, your current events from last week will be due, and I'm going to go ahead and score that and put that in as well. And then we're going to get started this week on something I told you about last week, and I previewed it or talked to you briefly at the beginning of this video, which is the Spanish-American War, specifically the 5 causes of the Spanish-American War. Now, when you think of American wars, you don't think of the Spanish-American War. You think of the Revolution, you think of the Civil War, World War I, World War II, Vietnam, and then lately, the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. You don't often think of the Spanish-American War, and really the reason that is because it was such a tiny, quick little war. We lost more men to disease than actual battles in the Spanish-American War. And we're actually going to spend more time talking about the reason it happened than the actual war itself. And we're going to break this up into a 5-part series. Today I'm going to go this is part 1, and we're going to talk about the first of the 5 reasons that the war happened. And that first reason is the Cuban Revolution. All right. So follow along in your notes. If you want to fill this out as you go, you're certainly welcome to. If you've already filled it out and you're just watching this for funsies, that's cool too. Let's go ahead and look at number 1, the Cuban Revolution. So the Cuban Revolution happened for a couple of reasons. The first one was simply, at this time, Cuba was being controlled by the country of Spain. It was Spain considered it a colony, and Spain controlled it. And Spanish leaders were in charge of Cuba and giving orders in Cuba. And one of the main economic sources there in Cuba, one of the ways they made money there in Cuba, was selling sugar, and mostly to the United States. What happened in 1894, as part of a Tariff Reform Act, there was something called the Wilson-Gorman Tariff. Now, the Wilson-Gorman Act didn't really start out being a a tariff. It was actually going to be tariff reform, but in the process of when it started to when it was finally passed and signed by President McKinley, it had changed quite a bit. And what happened was that it put an extra tax on foreign sugar coming into the United States. This was an attempt to prop up sugar grown and processed here in the United States, and it was an attempt to make that more profitable for American businesses instead of foreign businesses. And so it ended up increasing quite a bit, this tax on sugar coming in. That impacted Cuba a great deal. It destroys the Cuban sugar industry, and it throws a ton of people out of work in Cuba. And it really creates this huge economic depression in Cuba. And it was, but it was still pushed by American sugar producers because they didn't really care about the Cuban sugar producers. They wanted to sell their own, and you can't blame them. They want to sell things, so they did that. But it had this huge effect on Cuba. Before this tax, this tariff, in 1894, the Cuban sugar trade to the U.S. was $100 million. And this was back in that day's money, and in today's money, it would be far more than that. It was a significant portion of the Cuban economy. And that tariff caused a huge drop-off in sugar jobs, leading to severe unemployment in Cuba, like 90% unemployment. Here in the United States right now, with this COVID-19 pandemic that's going on, we have over 20 million Americans in the last few weeks have applied for unemployment insurance. But that's not even a percentage, a very big percentage of the total population. 90% of the people in Cuba lost their jobs. They became unemployed. So basically everybody lost their job. This led to a huge economic depression. And Cuba, as a Spanish colony, they naturally looked to Spain for help. They said, hey, you're the boss of us. You're in charge. Do something. Help us. We're starving. The economy is wrecked. Nobody's making any money. Nobody can buy any food. We need help. And Spain was like, what? Somebody say something? No, okay, no, we're good. No, we're good. You guys are fine. You'll be fine. You're fine. Fine. You're cool. Spain did nothing to help solve the depression going on in Cuba. To their credit, they probably didn't know what to do. That was a huge thing. How do you respond to that? Spain probably didn't really have a solid answer as to what to do, but that didn't really help the Cuban people at all. And it led to a revolt in an attempt to end Spanish rule. The Cubans were like, look, if you're going to control us, if you're going to tell us what to do, but when we need you, you're not going to help us, why do we need you? We can rule ourselves poorly, if nothing else. We don't need you ruling us poorly. If you're not going to help us, you're out of here. And so the depression, starvation leads to a lot of revolutions around the world throughout the history of time. People are hungry, they're upset, and they naturally want to take it out on the people in charge. This was no different. The Cuban people said, if you're not going to help us, we don't need you. And all of a sudden, they revolted. All right. It was led, and you can see his picture here. Jose Marti led the Cuban rebels. He was a major figure in the Cuban Revolution movement, and he did not live to see the end of Spanish rule, as I recall, but he was a galvanizing force in that revolution. So we're going to take a quick look here at a political cartoon of the time. if we were in class, we would be talking about what it actually meant. I would be, you guys could come up, take a closer look at this. You could, tell me what you thought it meant, but I'm just going to skip that part because, we're not there and you're not here. What you see here is a woman representing Cuba. She's in traditional Cuban garb at the time with a Cuban flag. And she's in a frying pan labeled Spanish Misrule. And underneath this frying pan are the flames of anarchy. And basically, this was a U.S. cartoon designed to show that that Spanish rule in Cuba was harming the Cuban people. The anarchy, the violence in the streets was hurting the Cuban people, and perhaps that both of those things needed to go away. This was in reference to this policy here, and it's a Spanish word. I'm not really going to try to pronounce that. I don't want to disrespect the language, but in English, that is a reconcentration policy. We're going to get to that in just a moment. So the reconcentration policy was the Spanish response to the Cuban Revolution. They said, look, the Spanish were fighting in traditional forms, uniforms, patrols, identifiable groups. The Cuban rebels, though, were fighting more of a guerrilla type warfare where they weren't in uniforms. They would attack Spanish troops and then disappear into the surrounding countryside, into the surrounding villages. And it was almost impossible for the Spanish troops to say who was doing the fighting for the Cubans. So they said, well, if these Cuban, revolutionaries are hiding amongst the people in these villages out in the country, we're just going to remove that scenario from a possibility. And they said, we are going to reconcentrate you. And they sent out this was a program led by the Governor General of Cuba. His name was Weyler, General Weyler. He was nicknamed the Butcher by the U.S. newspapers. And he came up with this reconcentration policy. And essentially what he said is, you have 8 days, people of Cuba, to move from your home to these concentration camps that we have set up around the country. And you're going to report to those camps immediately. Leave your stuff, you, the kids, load up, just you, and come to these camps. And if you don't, we're going to move you. And ultimately what that ended up being was, became known eventually as the Cuban Holocaust. Over 200, somewhere between 200 and 400,000 Cubans were murdered in about an 18-month time, trying to move them into these concentration camps. And some of the pictures are just startling. We see the pictures of the concentration camps in World War II. The pictures from the Cuban people during this time are equally bad, equally startling, equally horrifying. And it's just, it was a brutal policy. And it was an attempt to control these rebels. They said, look, if there's not people in these villages, these Cuban revolutionaries can't hide in these villages, and we will have these people controlled. And that will put an end to the violence. Well, obviously, it did not end the violence. In fact, it increased the violence for a lot of people. And just hundreds of thousands of people ended up dying before this was over. In the U.S. newspapers, and we're going to get to the newspapers in part 2 of this lesson, U.S. newspapers had a field day talking about Weyler the Butcher. They posted all kinds of political cartoons, all kinds of articles. The reconcentration policy in Cuba was huge news in the United States during this time. And they literally published as much as they could about Weiler the Butcher. And you can see a couple of cartoons here showing Weiler the Butcher. And this is traditional prison garb back in the day. And what they've got him in a leg iron. It says he may serve his country still further. He is busting rocks with a hammer, basically saying this man deserves to be in jail. This picture over here, you can see the great Weiler ape. Very negative depiction of General Weiler. Basically saying he is a wild animal and deserves to be behind bars, deserves to be caged for what he is doing. And to that aspect, the newspapers were probably right about what needed to be done with Weiler. But again, we'll learn tomorrow that the newspapers weren't necessarily doing this to benefit the Cuban people. They were ultimately doing it to benefit themselves. A little sneak preview into tomorrow. All right. So ultimately what happens, we're going to pause on the Cuban Revolution there because we will touch on it in a couple of other of these topics. But this is the setting for the remainder of the 4 reasons that we're going to be talking about in the next 4 parts of this lesson. All those 4 parts are being done while this Cuban Revolution is going on. And the people are being thrown into camps and being brutalized. That's the setting that we're going to find ourselves in. So that is the first reason we got into the Spanish-American War. It started with the Cuban Revolution. So we're going to wrap it up here today. I'm going to go ahead and get this video rendered and uploaded. And I will get that assignment posted within the next hour or so. And we will spend the next week and a half working on this lesson. So hope you all are doing okay at home, and I miss you. And I'm going to see if I can do a guest video appearance in our classroom, maybe put this up on the smartboard and teach it live from the classroom on a remote location, take a field trip to the school if Mr. Gutierrez will let me, and that might be fun. So take care and peace. If anyone has a hidden immunity idol and would like to play it, now would be the time to do so.